This is a spoiler warning for the 1977 film Eraserhead, directed by David Lynch.
Oh, you are sick. Some inane, bizarre person with a disturbed mind wrote that film.
It's the weirdest thing I've ever seen. It was the best thing I've seen all year.
This time I interpreted it as a nightmare.
Hello and welcome to the second recap episode of Scratching Heads, where I, again, sit in my office and reminisce about the previous episode. This time, my guest was Plato. As usual, I will first tell you about how I got a hold of our guest. My journey was far less easy than the one preceding it. I wouldn't hesitate to call it hard, but I prevailed. While it is said that in the last year, the location of Plato's grave was found, it turns out that this information was wrong. I dug up, reanimated, and showed several beings the film Eraserhead, and yet none of them turned out to be the famous philosopher. One of those beings, which shall remain nameless for the purposes of this episode, did tell me a little secret. They gave me the location of a map leading to Plato's grave. They also mentioned that this is not the first time they have been reanimated. Apparently, and this was news to me, another group of podcasters made their way to Greece to interview the deceased. But not in the noble pursuit of showing them Eraserhead, no, something more sinister. They seem to have been shown the film Antichrist by Lars von Trier. I could not have predicted this in my wildest dreams, but it seems as though we have competition, and they are more than just one guy. The thought of employing an intern crossed my mind again, but at least for this episode, I still needed to venture alone. When arriving at the temple where my map led me, I saw it. The tiles on the ground were shifted, and the shriveled corpse of the philosopher sat there on an office chair, leaning onto a table. Shapes in the dust that had already settled revealed that there once was not one, but 3 microphones placed on the table. I almost collapsed at the thought of what had occurred here. But I needed to pull through, and I knew that. Weakened as I was, I didn't manage to say the proper verses, and the spell that I reanimated him with turned out to be a weak one. This has luckily not had an effect on the podcast itself, but rather the stench of the man sitting before me. I knew I needed to do this quickly. I showed him the film, prepared the microphone, which he was sadly already used to, and then asked away. During the interview, I was surprised by his knowledge of industrialization and the existence of the proletariat. He even acknowledged Henry as an oppressed worker and not a slave. Luckily, he spoke about the cave allegory. This gave me hope that this episode would still turn out to be an original piece. Quite frankly, I was also surprised that he was focusing on the family structures within the movie, that the topic of parenthood seemed close to his heart, beating for only the purpose of this episode. To be honest, I was tired. The journey to Plato's final resting place and the thought of the other podcasters having already interviewed him made me sick. His attitude helped me through this hardship. Him genuinely asking for my opinion and answering my question honestly made all the difference in this case. I will play an excerpt of one of my favorite parts of the episode right now.
You have to understand the allegory of the cave not only as a visualization of human perception, but also as a symbolic reflection on the restrictive nature of isolated societal environments. The people in the cave, as well as Henry, don't strive for better living conditions, although you could argue that Henry has a sense of a situation, but not enough evidence to definitively estimate his conditions, nor of an improvement that could possibly be reached. In conclusion, people, as a first step, need to achieve reflective consciousness for their own living conditions, and then, as a second step, inevitably need to become aware of better living conditions that can deal as a goal and ultimately trigger the urge for change. Those steps can't be taken in the situation that is constructed in the allegory of the cave and Eraserhead. Lynch constructs an empty world, mostly constructed of liminal spaces and people that lead similar lives as Henry. Claire's consciousness doesn't exist beyond the fact of the existence of the obscure figure of a boss that Henry's mentioning of prior work in the factory implies. The comparison to the captives in the cave visualized the claustrophobic situation of Henry. Still, in the allegory, there's a small possibility of ascending the cave against all odds or becoming aware of the outer world. The most important question that results from this interpretation is if the world that Lynch constructs allows Henry the possibility to gain consciousness for a situation, or actively restricts those thought processes, and if the latter is true, how does it secure the unawareness? Is there a loophole for Henry that would help him to escape his captivity?
He criticized that the movie doesn't show any other solution but suicide. Well, I believe that the topic of suicide is kept quite ambiguous, because the woman in the radiator, which has been a great addition to our program, does not have to be interpreted as a sign of death, I think at least. She could be considered a kind of salvation that has left the cave, as Plato would call it, and sees the world now differently, and the people of the world, or Henry as we see him, perceives her differently, like a different being. She knows how to retreat from this world that he lives in, and in the end, he joins her. This interpretation would rule the end not as a suicide, but as exactly what Plato has said. This loophole, the leaving of the cave, seeing reality, but seeing the person that has left before you as something else, something you cannot comprehend. But that was just a thought I had. My God, I have jet lag from the flight to Greece. I now have a conversation with my superior about if I am going to be allowed to keep doing this program. If it ends well, you will hear back from me very, very soon. If not, you will probably never hear from me again, and I will be banished to the abyss. So, fingers crossed. Thank you very much for listening to Scratching Heads. Goodbye.